Welcome back, everybody. Now, it's pretty common in card games that people like to complain about decks they think are overpowered, or decks they think are too strong in the format, or just decks they hate playing against. And when I was watching one of these conversations unfold on Verbank, I started thinking about what I feel are the most annoying decks to play against. And I thought it would make a really good video, not only to share my personal experience or my personal opinions, but also to hear some of yours as well, and to see if there was any crossovers between them. Now, once again, I'm going to say that I think this list is incredibly subjective, and what people hate to play against or they find annoying to play against is going to vary quite a lot by the person. But once again, these are going to be my top 10 most annoying decks to play against. Starting off here, Night March. Now, Night March just does a lot of things wrong, in my opinion, both from the playing side and from the deck building side. Starting off here, I despise decks that essentially you only play 4 double colorless in. I think that's just really bad game building and really bad deck design. Not that it's bad deck design, because obviously that's the way to play the deck, but I think it's really poor game design when you can have decks that get away with doing that. On top of that, I also think it's really bad game design when the format is largely based around burning through your deck as quickly as possible and absolutely having no real concern for resource management, which is once again what Night March does. This is the company through things like Battle Compressor and then Shaman EX. And then from the playing side of it, you have really weak Pokemon that are going to be taking one-hit knockouts. And I think that's not necessarily bad, but I think just the deck design in general, compared with the sheer annoyance of these self-replacing little Pokemon that take absolutely no investment to hit for absolutely insane amounts of damage, it's just poor game design all around, and it makes for a very unfun experience to play against. Next up is going to be ShopatDonk. ShopatDonk was primarily in the 2009 year, a little bit in 2010 as well, but it essentially there's been a couple of variations of the deck, but essentially the idea is to draw through your entire deck as quickly as possible. You do things like Unknown R, Victory Medal, Pokédraw, and essentially you try to create a game state where you have basically just Shuppet and Uxie. And essentially you have Shuppet, you attach a Psychic, 4+ powers, you hit for 70 damage, 90 damage with an Expert Belt if this is 2010, for example, and then you return it to your hand. And you just rinse and repeat this combo every single turn. It's incredibly stupid. On top of this, you can also, the alternate version of doing this is with Uxie, where essentially you play Uxie, attach an energy, 4+ powers, your Expert Belt, and then you hit for 80 damage. You put Uxie on the bottom of your deck. Make sure that Uxie is the top card, so when you draw, it's automatically going to be Uxie. You can set up to draw the rest of the cards, and you just basically rinse and repeat this combo. You're never going to deck out. Now, if that's not bad enough, and I should all point out that you are supposed to do this on the first turn of the game, and ideally knock out your opponent's active Pokemon. So they don't even get a turn. Like, your opponent's not even supposed to play the game against this deck. Now, if that's not bad enough, you also have Crobat and Poketurn. And the idea of the deck is that essentially you can spread, I would say between Crobat, Poketurn, Super Scoop Up, essentially you get about somewhere between 8 to 10 damage counters to place on your opponent's bench. You can knock out one bench Pokemon very easily, and I would say pretty commonly you should knock out 2. Plus you should have, between the Fade Out and the plus powers, you should be able to knock out the active. So essentially on the first turn of the game, before your opponent is even drawn, before they even get a chance to do anything, you can knock out 3 Pokemon relatively consistently with this deck. Now, the only things that kept this deck from being an absolute, I would say, bannable instantly deck was that it did have some weaknesses. Obviously, like if you're playing against, let's say, any sort of SP Pokemon that are relatively high hit points. For example, let's say they had Dialga, you wouldn't be able to push over that, and then as soon as they hit that trainer lock with Deafen, you're not going to win the game. Spiritomb, it couldn't really do a whole lot against Spiritomb because you ended up playing about 30 or 40 trainers to draw through your deck as quickly as possible. And then if you got to that point, stuff like Psychic Lock, where essentially they just don't have powers, could also be very strong against it. Not quite as strong because you could still use the Fade Out combo, but you could not use the Uxie combo for it. But essentially, the deck just could knock out up to 3 basic Pokemon, win the game before you even get a chance to have a turn. Now, yes, like I said, there was weaknesses to it, but if you're not playing an SP deck, or if you're not playing a deck, if you're playing a deck, even if you're playing a deck with Spiritomb, if you don't open with the Spiritomb, they can still do all of this before you even draw. It was just an incredibly unfun deck to play against, and you never really had any sort of great game interactions with it. On top of that, yeah, it's... How do I want to say it? It's once again just really bad game design when the entire point is to draw through your deck on the first turn of the game, and there's really nothing to it. It's just complete abandonment for your resources. You just turn and burn your entire deck to get through it as quickly as possible. Just play card, play card, play card, play card. There's zero resource management in this deck, which once again I think is very bad game design. Just an all-around unfun experience to play against. Next up is going to be Turn 2 Medicham EX. This was from the 2005 format. You saw it a little bit in the 2006 format as well, but essentially the idea was you open Jirachi, you would ideally play, you Wishing Starred, so you'd ideally get 2 Wishing Stars off, and then on the second turn of the game, you would swoop Teleporter the Jirachi into Medite, play Evolve into Medicham, start spreading damage to your opponent's side of the board with Pure Power, and then as soon as your opponent took a knockout, you would POW up something on the bench, Rockets Admin them to a very low hand size, play a Team Aqua's Hideout to increase the retreat cost by 1, and then just completely control the game with things like POW, Hand Extension, ER2, and then Wiser Roar, not allowing them to use any powers. Now, there was some ways to play around this. If you played very high switching counts like Switch or Warp Point, Mr. Briny's Compassion, or if you were playing a deck that required very little investment in attackers or didn't really play any setup attackers like Nidoqueen, for example. And what I mean by setup attackers is just basically bench setters like Macargo, or, for example, if you played like the Hidden Legends Metagross, for example, something like that, Jirachi, Dunsparce even. And you wouldn't think is Jirachi or Dunsparce would be something that could be locked in the active spot, but you got to remember that Team Aqua's Hideout is adding 1 to the retreat cost, so you need to spend 2 energy to retreat the Dunsparce. And even if you're able to retreat that Dunsparce back to the bench, all they have to do is POW it active again, and you literally just wasted 2 energies to retreat it, and then you're in the exact same spot with a Dunsparce and no energy stuck in the active spot. It was just incredibly annoying to play against. So much so that this deck won Nationals with relative ease that year, and was the heavy favorite of the format going into Worlds. It just so happened that Nidoqueen was the, I guess, secret deck for Worlds that year and ended up having a very good matchup against it. But unless you were playing Nidoqueen, it is one of the most annoying decks to play against in the 2005 format. Next up is Seismitoad Slurpuff. Now, I think you could... Seismitoad was dominant for several years in a row, and I think you could make a lot of different arguments of which Seismitoad variants was the most annoying to play against. I personally just chose the Slurpuff version because this was once again the format where you essentially just had wild abandonment, no resource management. You just burned through your deck as quickly as possible, played all of the stupid cards in the format like Crushing Hammer and Toxic Laser, and then at the end of it, you just shuffled it all back in your deck with Lysander's Trump card. There was literally no resource management in this format, and it was, once again, a format where you just tried to burn through your deck as quickly as possible. It was a deck that played basically 4 double colorless energies. Sometimes you'd throw some water energies or something in there, but the deck would get away with playing almost incredibly low energy counts. And all of that aside, we haven't even talked about the Seismitoad yet, which that Quaking Punch says your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand. It just completely controlled the game, completely. I won't say it shut your opponent out of the game because it really didn't. But essentially, this was also a format where you basically had to build your deck playing a ton of item cards, and then Seismitoad just basically shut that off. And then you had a ton of things to change the damage output. You'd have things like Muscle Band, Hypnotoxic Laser. You could play Rock Guard in this. You could play things that would pick up the Seismitoad EX to recycle the Rock Guard. And then at the very end of it, you just Lysander's Trump card, shuffling everything back into your deck. Once again, I don't think Seismitoad by itself, I don't necessarily think is a problem. I think when you combine Seismitoad with all of the broken items in the format, and then Lysander's Trump card to completely recycle everything and use those broken items over and over and over again, that's when you really started to get into problems. Next up, Gothitelle Gore. I would say this deck was huge in 2013. I'm going to even say it was possibly the best deck in the format in 2013. And I'm going to say it was played in 2014. Virizion Genesect kept it in check, but it did win seniors at the 2014 World Championships. But essentially, what you did is you had Gothitelle in the active spot, shut your opponent out of playing any sort of item cards. Then you would use Gore's Duck and Cover for 50 damage, shuffle it into your deck, and it would paralyze and poison the defending Pokemon. And then you would use Dusknoir to simply move that damage counters around. Keldeo was an answer to this, but essentially all that would happen, especially in 2013 when Catcher wasn't even on a coin flip, you would just go Pokemon Catcher the Keldeo, and then on top of that, the Keldeo was Grass Weak, so you'd be hitting it for 100 plus poison. So by the time it got back into your turn, even if they did the Keldeo switch combo, you'd still have 110 damage to move around with Dusknoir. Along with that, Gothitelle's got a very respectable 130 HP. So even if they were able to, let's say best case scenario, they do the Russian retreat with Keldeo, they get out of the paralysis, come up and knock out your Gothitelle. Literally all they did was take a single prize, and you could rinse and repeat this combo again with Gore on the following turn. The deck played a very thick Gothitelle line. Usually it was like a 4-1-3 along with a Super Rod. So you just simply play down another Gothitelle. Now, I am going to give this deck some credit. It does take a little bit of setup to get going. And the format also gives decks some ways to play around this with things like Keldeo. 2 Keldeo EX was very standard at the time. And in the later stages when Gothitelle was the biggest deck in the format, or one of the scariest decks in the format, you did see in some situations up to 3 Keldeo EX to help answer it. But it's just that unbreakable lock is what really was over the top for me. And along with that, it was a couple of other little things, like Gore I think is annoying, but by itself I think would have been fine. Gothitelle is annoying, but by itself it would have been fine. And when you put the two together, that's when you got problems. On top of that, Gothitelle was relatively easy to get out thanks to things like Tropical Beach. Its hit points are really respectable and would in most situations be two-shotted in the format. On top of that, too, it was basically 2 separate locks. It was an item lock, and then it was the paralyzed and poison lock. And the fact that you could get the Gothitelle lock very early and very easily, and you didn't even necessarily have to have the Gore at the exact same time, was, I think, one of the things that was kind of annoying to play against it as, because it wouldn't be uncommon for them to hit a turn 2 or turn 3 Gothitelle, and you're like, oh, I'm not paralyzed poison, but I literally can't play any item cards. On top of that, you don't have to Gore every single turn. It's not like they had to have this unbreakable lock with it. It was essentially where they could send up the Gore if they really needed to or in a certain situation, and they could paralyze poison you. And even if they weren't able to get another Gore on the following turn, they could still make plays and then set it up on the following turn. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not like they have to lock you every single turn and they lose. Even if they missed an Gore turn somewhere along the way, they would still be in a pretty dominant spot. Now, once again, I think these two are bad, but I think what really made the deck over the top broken was Dusknoir. And it was just the fact that you could move those damage counters around. So you could essentially lock something in the active spot, and then basically it didn't even matter what they had on their bench because you could just move damage back to knock it out. It was just so incredibly bad for the format, I think. It just to create that unbreakable lock with Dusknoir. I think if you would have taken away the poison damage on Gore and not had Dusknoir in the format, the deck would have been fine because they would have had that auto paralysis, but they would have had to take knockouts, and then you could have done something to hit the Gothitelle. Then I think the Gothitelle deck could have played stuff like Max Potion or some interesting things like that to kind of heal the Gothitelle, and I think you would have had a much better dynamic than what you ended up with. But in the end, it was just a super annoying deck to play, and Dusknoir just pushed it over the top. Alright, next up is going to be Rayquaza EX, Stantler, and Minun from the RS to PK format. I've talked about this deck a lot in the past, especially when I was talking about the RS to PK bans, or possible bans. But essentially, there's no problem with the deck in individual cards. It's just when you put everything together, you have that Stantler that can confuse evolved Pokemon, push away to discard key outs like Windstorm or supporters like Steven's Advice, Cessation Crystal to shut off all powers and bodies, Rayquaza EX to have that sniping, and then Minun just to do that constant sniff out on the POW, being able to POW lock the opponent. There was just so many little things that went together to make the deck just incredibly annoying to play against, and in my opinion, probably overpowered in the RS to PK format. Next up is going to be Trevenant Break. Trevenant is just ridiculously strong because of the one-sided item lock. I did not play when the break was in the game. I played with Trevenant and Gore, and I will say it was very annoying to have that one-sided item lock. The deck did have some counters in the format thanks to Virizion Genesect, but I think about a year or two, I think it was probably 2015 is when the Trevenant Break really started to see play, and then just to have that constant sniping on the bench with a one-sided trainer lock, it was very easy to get that trainer lock going on the first turn and just completely shut your opponent out of the game. Just, in my opinion, ridiculously overpowered. Next up is Dark Tyranitar Electrode EX. This was essentially 05-06, but I'm going to say it was the 06 format where the deck really became a problem. But essentially, the deck is just super annoying to play against because you don't have any ways to actually play the game. And what I mean by saying that is it's really hard to have a strategy against the deck because they completely control the pace of the game. You can't get them in any sort of POW situation or POW lock situation because they're always going to be behind in prizes until they're ready to take the lead. You can't avoid taking a prize to not get in that POW situation because they're just going to use Electrode EX to automatically put themselves down on prizes and have that POW available to them. They're also going to Rocket's Admin you to a very small hand size. And then, like I said, they don't actually have to take the lead. They can just sit there and go Spinning Tail and take 6 prizes that way. But at the exact same time, if there is something that you have as a really big threat, they can either bite off or grind to knock it out. They can POW up a big threat on the bench and knock it out. The deck could just make so many big plays, and there's nothing you could really do to stop it. You couldn't control the pace of the game. You couldn't slow them down much. It was just they controlled everything about the game. I'm also going to say it was kind of a combination of those turns where you couldn't even really build up something to fight the Dark Tyranitar because it was just going to get POW'd knocked out as soon as they did that Electrode EX combo. This is, once again, another one of those decks where there's not really a problem card in it. There's not really anything in particular that's super overpowered or super annoying. In their own right, everything is very fair, very balanced. I'm going to say I even think Electrode EX is very good card design, but it's just in combination with POW Hand Extension and then a card like Dark Tyranitar with such a wide variety of attacks, this is where you create a deck that's incredibly annoying to play against. All right, I think this is number 9. It's going to be Mewlock from the 2006 format. Mew is just, the whole Mewlock thing is just incredibly annoying to play against because it just does everything right? This is another one of those decks where I don't think there's really a problem in the deck. It just, when you put all these cards together, that's where it gets annoying. But essentially, the strategy behind Mewlock is you use Wobbuffet to increase the retreat cost. Usually you play a 2/2 Wobbuffet line, so your opponent is going to pay 2 more to retreat their active Pokemon. You let them take that first prize. You power up something on the bench, and then you basically just repeatedly use Sniff. You repeatedly use Sniff out to just get POW hand extensions back, and then you use Pure Power to spread damage around your opponent's board. You never take a prize in this game until basically the last turn or two, and then you just take all your prizes at once. The deck also plays a lot of really other annoying things. Minimum, like we talked about, Roselia, Battle Frontier, and then a very high Rockets admin count. You're always going to find yourself at a very low hand size with something locked in the active spot, and your bench is just going to be dying to Pure Power. It's very, very hard to play around this sort of deck or play around this sort of strategy because it is always designed to play from behind. So unless you're playing a very specific deck that can deal with it, like Powtar, the game is going to be near unwinnable. When I've been testing this on TCG1, I have gotten more rage quits playing this deck than I have about any other deck in the format. And lastly is Durrant. Now, Durrant's probably not going to rate as highly on other people's lists. I just absolutely despise this ant. It is literally one of the stupidest cards I've ever printed, and that's because there's absolutely nothing to it. You literally go Durrant. You throw 3 more Durrants on your bench, and you just basically attach a Metal Energy, and you just discard cards. Devour. 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 You do it every single turn. They knock a Durrant out. Alright, we'll go Revive. Devour. Devour. There's no strategy to the deck. There's no skill to the deck. There's really no, anything to the deck other than 4 Durrant in play, Devour. Now, I will say, as players got better about playing against it and they would go with a lone Zekrom strategy, the deck had to tech a little bit more. You started seeing Mewtwo EX in the deck along with double colorless energy. If you prize the Durrant, you need to be there's a little bit of things with figuring out your Rotom. But essentially, the deck is just a stupid, straightforward deck that doesn't do anything. And even if you're building a deck that counters Durrant, or you're playing a deck and you're adding counters for Durrant, there's a decent chance that those counters are just going to get discarded. At least with decks like Gothitelle, Gore, they require a little bit of setup, or things with Poucham, you can at least appreciate how well your opponent has to play the game, or how they have to balance resources. Same things with decks like Mewlock. There's literally nothing to it. They throw 4 ants in play and just say Devour. I mean, literally, Britney Spears could win with this deck. Not hating on Britney. I love Britney. Just anybody that doesn't even know the Pokemon card game, you could take 10 minutes, show them a Durrant deck, and they could probably top cut a tournament with it. I don't know, poor card design in my opinion. I won't even say poor card design. It was just a super annoying and stupid deck to play against. But that is my rant. That is my top 10 list. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? I guess post your top 10s down below. I'd love to get some good discussion going. See what you guys think are the most annoying decks to play against. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you in the next one.